Look, I'm telling my sellers today. I'm through.
Well, why don't you tell him at the same time why?
Don't worry, I will.
Yeah, and I bet you $10,000 you'll ask his ass off.
I don't give a damn if he does.
Marvin, what do you make of all this?
Man, I don't even have an opinion.
Well, you gotta have an opinion. I mean, do you think that God came down from heaven and stopped you?
Oh, what the fuck's happening? Oh,
man,
shit.
man. Oh, man, I shot Marvin in the face.
Why the fuck you do that?
Well, I didn't mean to do it. It was an accident.
Is this scene still as iconic and still as relevant as it used to be? Well, why don't we find out from some other people on the outside?
Pulp Fiction is one of the classic films of cinema that should be a little more celebrated than it is due to its cultural relevancy that still lies today. It is rough around the edges from a writing perspective and a purely action-based perspective, but it's so heartfelt and so driven by great acting. And the relevancy that it has today is there's still violence, there is still, division in the country and where things are headed, and the lack of empathy for that really pervades in the telling of Pulp Fiction and the story that it has, and how certain aspects of life can be used to hurt people, things such as drugs and racial divide and things of that nature. It's still a culturally relevant film today and should be watched by way more people.
So how is Pulp Fiction still relevant in everyday culture? Well, to me, I live in Switzerland, and Pulp Fiction is a movie that arises in conversation fairly regularly, so you can't go a whole year without Pulp Fiction being mentioned in some kind of a dialogue while you're at work or at a bar having a conversation. Something that's a topic that kind of always leads to Pulp Fiction. So somebody will always think of, oh yeah, this kind of reminds me of that scene in Pulp Fiction or this quote from Pulp Fiction. Every now and then there's like this connection that's being made, and it tells me that it's culturally relevant because it's a movie that people didn't watch just once, but they watch it over and over again to the point where they remember these scenes and you remember this dialogue and remember the lines, that when you talk about anything in an everyday conversation, they go, oh yeah, they did something like this, blah blah blah, in Pulp Fiction, right? So they make that connection, that association. So it's very much relevant still in everyday culture. I live in Switzerland. I don't know how relevant the movie is elsewhere in the world, if it's just a Western thing or not. But if this happens to me in Switzerland, I can only assume that it's an international phenomenon, right? So in that respect, just generally, it's still being talked about, it's still being used apparently in curriculum for an assignment. So it's definitely still a very relevant movie in a general aspect. But if you look at the actors and actresses, I mean, you got like Uma Thurman, you got Christopher Walken, Travolta, Samuel Jackson. I mean, these are big names who are still relevant today, and their contemporary relevance still makes the movie relevant, right? So people, if you're interested in these actors, you go and look at it from their history, and you see, oh, they were in this movie, I'm gonna watch that. And it's a Tarantino movie, who has made some great movies down the years, so people are definitely going to be drawn to this movie as well. So the cultural relevance is still pretty high, and this is without even getting into like granular details of the movie itself. We could talk about that for a while, but I just talked about the general relevance based on it being still the topic of contemporary conversations that have nothing to do with it, but leading up to the movie. And you have big names and actors and Tarantino, and I would say, there are some iconic scenes and iconic lines in the movie that are kind of like etched into your memory. Like one scene I remember is Christopher Walken talking about his gold watch. It's like an entire monologue where he's telling a story, and that just kind of scars you in your memory, and you kind of remember that, and you watch the movie again and again, and you notice it again and again, and it just becomes that thing that you remember. And then again, that leads to future conversations elsewhere, and then it kind of recycles that relevance over and over again. So it very much is still a relevant movie. I don't know if people are still watching it, how many are still watching it, but the fact that it still arises in conversations over and over again in everyday life tells me that it's still a very relevant, very culturally relevant movie.
So yeah, but what I can say is if the movie
is still suitable for nowadays audiences? And I would simply say it isn't. That is because, for example, the scenes are too long. The cutting style we have nowadays is pretty fast. We have a lot of short scenes, not a lot of long scenes like we have in the movie Pulp Fiction, where some of the scenes are like 8 to 10 minutes long. We usually don't do that nowadays. Also, the audio, the video, and the special effects quality is very old, and for people who watch it today compared to the movies that we have today, could seem a little bit old, a little bit too bad. Maybe some people would still watch it because of the nostalgia factor, but as someone who hasn't seen the movie at all or doesn't like movies in that kind of of that age, I don't really think they would like it. Also, music that's put in the background or how the actors look, it's pretty old-fashioned, so I would say no, it's not really a thing for nowadays audiences.
Now, I can only really speak for my generation. I was born in the year 2000, and honestly, I don't know many people around my age that have actually seen the film, let alone still think about it, still talk about it. Whereas if you look at films from a similar time, like Jurassic Park, for example, it came out a year before Pulp Fiction, and people still very much talk about it, and I mean, they're still making new films in the franchise today. Whereas if you look at Pulp Fiction, it's not talked about, and nothing new is coming out, no one thinks about the film. So to me, that says that Pulp Fiction is not relevant to today's audience.
Okay, so Pulp Fiction is a movie which has been directed by Quentin Tarantino and features actors such as John Travolta or Samuel L. Jackson. And in my personal opinion, I do not believe that this movie is still relevant for today's audience. Now, the reason for that I'm saying that is mainly because in today's generations, we don't see a capability of people to pay attention to things for a large amount of time, and that's important because given that this movie is a set of stories that are all combined and that are not chronologically presented, that might induce some difficulty in the audience to make sure that they understand all of the sections of the stories and how they intertwine with each other. And even though, for example, the comical aspects of this movie are very similar to movies that we see nowadays, such as, for example, Deadpool, I do not believe that this kind of movie would be very popular as it was in the moment that it was released.